I wanted to react to a really good video that I saw on YouTube that really explains how the rollout of these tariffs have been and how nonsensical the whole thing is. So let's have a look at this video and I'll give my thoughts.
President Trump refuses to let the United States be taken advantage of and believes that tariffs are necessary to ensure fair trade, protect American workers, and reduce the trade deficit. This is an emergency, it said. And so, because this is an emergency, Trump is, quote, invoking his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 to address the national emergency posed by the large and persistent trade deficit that's driven by the absence of reciprocity in our trade relationships and other harmful policies like currency manipulation and exorbitant value-added taxes perpetrated by other countries. Trump's going to impose.
Also, someone in the chat is saying, I'm scared manufacturing in the US is going to grow in prisons / black box type sites that abuse vulnerable workers. Yeah, that already happens though. So a lot of prisons in the US are privatized. And when things are privatized, obviously they're done for profit. And so that's why they call it like a prison industrial complex, right? A lot of companies actually invest in prisons, and prison workers work for certain corporations for less than minimum wage. And it's done legally because prisoners don't have rights, or at least the same rights that people that, you know, aren't in prisons have. So this will definitely happen in the sense that, you know, they will definitely move these into prisons, because a big reason, and she's going to talk about it in the video, I don't know where all of this money is going to come from. A lot of reasons why a lot of American businesses thrive is because they can go into China and they can go into Vietnam and they can pay people really cheap prices because the labor market is so much cheaper than the US. And if everything has to be forced back into the US, well, they can't take advantage of the cheap labor. So one loophole that they can take advantage of is the prisons, and get people in the prisons to do a lot of this work, right? So I definitely think this is something that we'll see more of if these tariffs are a long-term thing. That's definitely going to happen.
Impose a 10% tariff on all countries, and that took effect April 5th. Though certain individual countries will receive an individualized reciprocal higher tariff for those with which we have the largest trade deficits. During his press conference announcing the tariffs, he had a handy little chart, which I'll put on the screen for those watching. It laid out which countries are getting individualized treatment, including the percentage of tariffs that other countries charge us, and next to it, what the US will begin charging them starting this Wednesday, April 9th. The numbers are misleading, to say the least. For example, China is at the top of the list, with the graph indicating China charges the US 67% tariffs, and that the new US tariff on China will be 34%.
Obviously, this video is more talking about the initial things that happen. So obviously the tariff on China is a lot higher now. So that has to be mentioned.
Which makes it sound pretty reasonable, right? Like if China's adding 67% tariffs on all US goods, then 34% from the US is less than half what China is charging us. Frankly, it could be higher. It's not fair. The problem is that China literally does not charge 67% tariffs on US goods. The fine print under the heading on the chart that says tariffs charged to the USA, in case you can't read it, says including.
And this is where, once again, this is a very important point that she raised, where the understanding is that, oh, this is how much in tariffs they charge our country, so we're charging them this back. But it doesn't take into account, like the percentages don't take into account so many different factors that she will mention in this video. And that's why the formula and how they calculated the tariffs is completely nonsensical.
In currency manipulation and trade barriers. What does that mean? Well, we have pretty clearly defined categories of trade barriers. The U.S. Trade Representative in the Executive Office of the President issues a yearly report called the National Trade Estimate Report on Foreign Trade Barriers, laying out exactly what trade barriers exist in each country. They fall into 14 general categories that include things like import policies like tariffs, as well as technical barriers like restrictive and excessive regulations, government procurement like binational policies, inadequate intellectual property protections, overly regulated digital markets, market subsidies, anti-competitive practices, labor protection violations, harmful environmental practices, things that get in the way of free trade. These are things that all countries have to a certain extent, including the US, and knowing what barriers to trade exist in each country is a helpful tool for understanding trade with those countries, because it turns out each country is different and requires individualized economic policies, at least in theory. However, the problem is that what's written on Trump's pretty little graph is a lie. That percentage is not based, as the graph says, on tariffs, including currency manipulation.
Exactly. Because it's not based on tariffs, it's based on tariffs in addition to factors that Trump himself or his administration thinks affects the US economy. So that whole this is what they charge us and so we're charging that back doesn't actually make any sense when you look into it, because that's not actually what a lot of those countries are charging the US.
Manipulation or trade barriers. That percentage is based largely on a fancy looking formula that emphasizes the size of the
Oh no, not Trump's horrible formula. Not the terrible formula that we've been seeing everywhere. Oh no. This formula hurts my eyes at this point.
trade deficit we have with each country. That's to say, the difference in how much we export to China versus how much we import from China, for example. So we import more than we export to that country. Therefore, there's a trade deficit with that country. And my God, look at Vietnam. Vietnam puts 90% tariffs on US.
Also, let me also explain something about like trade deficits and like import and export, like which I think hasn't been talked about a lot when people have these conversations. So normally, if you import from a country more than you export, which means that, you know, in a sense, they benefit, let's say, according to what, if you look at it in a very weirdly normal way or simplistic way, they are benefiting more because we are importing more than we export to them. Therefore, we are giving them more money than we are getting from them. Well, the only reason why you would import more things from a country than you export is because they provide more valuable things that your country needs than the valuable things that you provide to them. So therefore, just charging tariffs doesn't change the fact that the reason in the first place why you imported from this country, more than you exported would be because they are providing more value to your country, which is why you need those goods from their country in the first place more than they need goods from your country. That's what people actually have not been mentioning the whole time. So it's like, we need to balance the books. It's so dumb. It's so silly. But anyway, let's continue watching.
US goods. So our new 46% tariffs are only half of what Vietnam charges for US goods. They could probably go even higher, except for the fact that that's not true. The 90% number includes our trade deficit with Vietnam. We import more from Vietnam than we export to Vietnam. And that's true. And when you pause for a second to rub your last remaining brain cells together, you can understand why. Vietnam has a lot of factories and a large workforce that works for pennies. And there's all sorts of human rights and other discussions we could have about that. But from a basic economic standpoint, Vietnam is able to undercut the global competition because it can produce things for dirt cheap or grow things in its insanely tropical climate that cannot be grown anywhere in the US. So we want those things because they're cheaper than the same things coming from elsewhere, or because we cannot make them ourselves. That's the basics of why people trade. On the other hand, US manufactured items have to comply with US laws about minimum wages and other restrictions. So anything manufactured here is going to be more expensive. Who the in Vietnam making 15 cents an hour is going to buy an American made item? The demand for expensive American made goods in Vietnam is very low. So when the demand is higher in the US and lower in Vietnam, we're going to import a hell of a lot more than we export to Vietnam. Slapping a 46% tariff on goods imported from Vietnam is not going to make the factory owners there think, wow, it would be so much easier and cheaper for me to move my factory to the US. Instead, they're going to mark up the price of their goods to cover the new tariff, and we will all pay more for those items here. Or they'll look at that list that he showed in his graph and say, the Philippines are pretty close to us and they provide cheap labor and they're only being charged 17% tariffs. So let's start moving our manufacturing there instead.
Exactly. Which is why this whole thing of like, oh, it's going to move all manufacturing to the US. Also, how big do people think the US is that global manufacturing is all just magically going to all move into the US? Like, I've heard a lot of people saying that this is going to bring all the production back to the US. Like, what? What? The US doesn't have that much space, you know? Like, what? People genuinely think that every single factory from Vietnam is going to magically reappear in the US. And then also, like she mentioned, of course, my focus is fashion, which is why I focus more on like factories and stuff. But even when it comes to agriculture, there are things that the US imports for cheap from Vietnam, like foods, that can't even be grown in a lot of parts of the US because the US doesn't have the correct vegetation to even grow those things in the first place. So you're not going to magically change the vegetation of the US and start growing those things in the US. Like, it just, the whole thing doesn't make any sense.
On top of that, Basing these new retaliatory tariffs on the import and export of goods, of items, dramatically misses the full picture in many ways. But specifically, according to the New York Times, the United States is the world's largest exporter of services, streaming services, media, technology, banking, tourism. None of these services fall into the trade deficit calculation because they're not goods. So the US imports more goods from the EU than it exports, but it exports more services than it purchases, according to the New York.
And once again, like she has gratefully pointed out, that's why the whole tariffs percentage thing and the formula doesn't make any sense. Because there are so many things that you're not accounting to that is still an export and an import and actually is very important to the economy and how exactly your economy, like how you can balance the trade deficit with your economy. You have to look at things like the services that are exported or imported also. You can't just be like, oh, they charge this tariff on this specific good, so we're going to charge it back. Like, it doesn't make sense.
New York Times, quote, if you counted services in the trade gap in Mr. Trump's formula, the tariffs on the EU would shrink almost in half. And on top of that, there are certain countries with which the US has a trade surplus, meaning we export more than we buy from them. And according to Trump, that's supposed to be good. And yet there are at least 100.
Which is funny. So another thing about Trump's, I think she's going to mention it, but another funny thing about Trump's tariffs that didn't make sense is that, so if they are trying to balance the books, right? If there is a country where you export more than you import, therefore it's in your favor. You're making money from that because you are exporting more goods to that country than you are importing. So why do those countries have tariffs? That doesn't make sense, because if Trump is trying to balance the books, why would you increase tariffs in a country like that? That doesn't make much sense.
100 countries and territories with which we have a trade surplus, and they were all included in that blanket 10% tariff. They now have 10% tariffs, whether or not we are in a trade surplus with them. And when asked to explain how they got to these random tariff numbers, the U.S. Office of Trade Representatives put out a document trying to make the formula seem fancy by using little Greek symbols. But the problem is that there are people in the world that have studied math and know what the symbols mean, and were able to look at the formula and call bullshit. Many have pointed out that a couple of the symbols mean literally nothing. The tariff rate is multiplied by two variables, one meant to approximate the price elasticity of import demand, and one to approximate the tariff pass-through to retail prices. What does that mean? I don't know. I'm not an economist, but what I do know is the number approximating the price elasticity of import demand that they chose was 4, the number 4. And the number that
we do have space is what's being done with it. Florida, Louisiana, Hawaii, PR all have tropical climates. So essentially what I was saying is that you need to remember that these tariffs don't affect one industry, they affect all industries. So if we talk about fashion, for example, because if everything works out the way that Trump is thinking that's going to work out, a lot of these companies will be forced to manufacture in the US. That's his whole thing. It's like, we're bringing manufacturing back to the US. All of these companies make all these products and it doesn't benefit US citizens. So you don't have the space for every industry. You have to pick and choose. So you might have the space for some stuff, but you don't have the space of all of the agriculture in Vietnam. So there's no way you're going to just uproot the whole agricultural industry in Vietnam and place it in the US. And even if you did that, then where's the space for all the other stuff, like all the manufacturing of the microchips and the manufacturing of clothing and the manufacturing of automotives? Where is the space for all of this stuff? If for you to have the space for all of this stuff, you'd have to basically, I don't even know what you would have to do to have the space to have for every single industry. And then besides space, another thing that you also need to think about is expertise. Even if you have the space, everyone now has to be trained to make it to the same scale that is being made in all these different countries that are being tariffed. On top of that, you need to think of the labor cost. How exactly is the US going to make, the production of a lot of these things profitable? Because a lot of things, like let's say production of bananas, the reason why it's profitable is because a lot of places where like bananas are cultivated have cheap labor markets. Places in Africa, in South America, these are where people, produce a lot of bananas, right? How are you going to produce all these things in the US and it's profitable when labor costs are higher? They can't exploit workers the way that they do in all these other markets. So you have to think of it from all the different angles. You can't just, even if you have the space, there's so many other issues that you have to overcome for it to actually make sense, which is why to me it's very simplistic to be like, we can just move everything to the US. It won't work out that way. It just won't.
That they chose to approximate the tariff pass through to retail prices was 0.25. So they take those two numbers and multiply them by the tariff rate. The problem is that 4 times 0.25 equals 1. So they're multiplying the tariff rate by 1. And what do you get when you multiply a number by 1? The same number. It does nothing. It is made up math to sound smart. And they're betting based on accurate historical data, frankly, that their supporters.
Also, Anglerfish, exactly what you're saying, right? China made it their business to be the world's factory. It took time to build up infrastructure to that point. Factories and roads don't grow like beans. Exactly. And just what Cam is saying, you can't match the production scale of Asia and the rest of the world overnight, especially because they have been building their infrastructure to manufacture all these things for decades. So how exactly, and this is why, going back to my amazing questions, right? I always say, how long is it going to take to build some of this infrastructure in the US? And how much is it going to cost to build this infrastructure in the US? And if they build this infrastructure in the US, who is going to pay for it? These 3 questions need to be answered. All 3 of them need to be answered. Also, Tarek saying, the underlying idea is to make the US less reliant and exploited by its trading partners and NATO allies. It's a good idea for trying to reposition a superpower on the down of capitalism. So yeah, that is the point, for the US to be less reliant. But the whole point of it being less reliant is by a lot of the manufacturing moving to the US, which is why I then end up posing all those questions, right? So that's where I wonder what the answers to those 3 questions are.
Won't know the difference. Is that 4 times 0.25 equals 1. So they're multiplying the tariff rate by 1. And what do you get when you multiply a number by 1? The same number. It does nothing. It is made up math to sound smart. And they're betting based on accurate historical data, frankly, that their supporters won't know the difference. The formula that the White House used then, boiled down, was our total trade deficit with the country in dollars divided by the value of the goods in dollars that we import from the country. Why? I don't know. So using an example reported on by MSNBC, we have a $66 billion trade deficit with South Korea, and we import $133 billion in goods from South Korea. 66 is 50.3% of 133. So South Korea's tariff rate is listed as 50%. And then to get our new tariff on the country, they then just divided that number in half because Trump thinks he's being nice by just charging half of what they charge us in these made-up tariffs. So the made-up formula is weirdly applied in a blanket manner to almost all countries, regardless of underlying factors and actual trade barriers that are important to consider when setting tariffs. But also there are exceptions put in place that complicate that and kind of don't make any sense either. For some reason, Afghanistan's tariff numbers were calculated using a different formula. China's tariff.
Good points he made once again, because first of all, there are exceptions, and I read it earlier in the Financial Times article. There are certain industries that have exceptions, and the tariffs don't take into account a lot of those exceptions because the tariffs are looking at total imports and exports. And then also they're talking about balancing the trade deficit, but they're not looking at services exported and imported either. So it's a mess.
Tariff numbers are cumulative. So they amount to a total of 54% tariffs on China. So these new additional 50% tariffs Trump is threatening against China just today would put tariffs on Chinese goods at 104%. Steel and aluminum and cars are not included. Neither are copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber articles, bullion, and energy and other certain minerals that are not available in the United States. So it applies blanket tariffs where it doesn't make sense and exceptions where it weirdly complicates things. And get this, even the American Enterprise Institute, like ground zero for kooky right-wing economic think tank theories, was like, wait, this math is bad. They literally published a blog post titled, quote, President Trump's tariff formula makes no economic sense. It's also...
And this is what I was alluding to earlier. When you have people that literally normally under normal circumstances will always defend their political leanings, for them to look at the formula and say it makes no sense is insane. Is insane. President Trump's tariff formula makes no economic sense, and it's also based on an error. Crazy.
Also based on an error. That's the whole title. Because in addition to posting the formula that they used, the US Office of the Trade Representative also cited to their sources, and people then checked those citations. In the American Enterprise Institute post, the authors write, quote, even if one were to take the Trump administration's tariff formula seriously, it makes an error that inflates the tariffs assumed to be levied by foreign countries fourfold. Remember one of those numbers, 0.25, which when multiplied by 4 cancels itself out in the formula and doesn't make sense? That's in part because it was the wrong number. The number should have been closer to 1. 1, when multiplied by 4, equals 4. So the top number should have been divided by 4, not divided by 1, meaning the tariff rates are 4 times higher than they should be by the government's own reasoning. So Vietnam's rate of 46% should actually be 12.2%. As the American Enterprise Institute authors state, and I cannot believe I'm quoting approvingly from that institution, quote, our view is that the formula the administration relied on has no foundation in either economic theory or trade law. But if we are going to pretend that it is a sound basis for US trade policy, we should at least be allowed to expect that the relevant White House officials do their calculations carefully. And from a far-right extremist think tank, no less, proving officially once and for all that there is one hard line that conservatives do actually have when it comes to Trump's behavior. It's the economy, stupid. Not to say he hasn't messed with the economy before in detrimental ways, but this time he's gone so far that even people with the cognitive dissonance necessary to overlook his past actions are able to stop and say, hold the damn phone. So not only are the numbers a lie and the math faulty, the basis for these tariffs is completely illogical, not least of which because these aren't retaliatory tariffs, because to be retaliatory necessitates the existence of tariffs to retaliate against, and these tariff numbers are entirely made up. Here are 3 more reasons.
Exactly. Like you can't they can't be retaliatory tariffs if all the formulas are wrong and all the math is wrong, so therefore they're just random.
That's why these tariffs.
And also, if you're tariffing, like she mentioned earlier, if you're levying all these tariffs on countries where you actually export more to than you import, what is the retaliation there? You already have a positive trade deficit with that country. So why would you? There's nothing to retaliate against.
Make no sense. Number one, multiple of Trump's own cabinet members, not least of which his Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, have said that this is part of a long-term plan. And yet they are bragging that countries are coming to the negotiating table to work out a deal to lower or eliminate the tariffs. So are these tariffs long-term, or are they just bargaining chips? That uncertainty is roiling the global markets. On the one hand, Trump is promising that these tariffs will bring back manufacturing jobs to the US. And on the other hand, they're being touted as simply how Trump makes a deal to make countries pay more. But if the countries do come to the table, like he says they are, and they do make a deal to pay us more in exchange for lower tariffs, for example, that means that those markets will open back up and these tariffs will be short-lived. Getting companies to move manufacturing back to the US isn't something that happens in a couple weeks or months. It takes multiple years and tons of money to relocate a factory.
Also, something that I've been fascinated by when I was thinking about this whole thing, right? Because obviously the infrastructure to build, if you're trying to build the kind of manufacturing infrastructure that they have in certain Asian countries, that's so advanced, way more advanced than a lot of the infrastructure that we have in the West. First of all, it's so funny because, first of all, the people that have the expertise to even build this kind of manufacturing are in Asia. So if you don't want to work with Asian countries because you're tariffing them, who exactly is going to build these things when no one has the expertise, because those kind of factories don't even exist outside of Asia? Like, how do you even build those in the first place? And then second of all, say they were to build it, they'd have to work with some Asian countries eventually. So those tariffs can't be like that forever, because if you want to build the infrastructure, you need the expertise, because people in America don't have the same expertise of building that kind of manufacturing that they do in Asia, because that's literally what they do in countries like China. That is their focus, manufacturing. So I don't even know how that's going to work. And then on top of that, if these things take, let's say, 5 to 10 or maybe even more years, which is more realistic on how it's going to take, these aren't going to be built in 6 months. What happens when a new president comes in that completely disagrees with this and walks some of this stuff back? So what happens if, as a company, you're halfway through building some stuff in the US, and then a new president comes in, and then it's no longer favorable to have your factory in the US. Now you've spent all this money. And that's why I believe a lot of companies aren't going to invest in the US, especially not in the short term, because there's too much uncertainty. Because Trump can just decide with a drop of a hat, the same way he's like, we're going to put tariffs. And then he's like, okay, there's a 90-day grace period. It's led to a loss of confidence in his administration. And so a lot of the advice that I've seen is just sit back and just wait and see what happens. So a lot of these companies are actually just waiting to see what happens. So this whole thing that, companies are going to scramble to start manufacturing in the US doesn't make sense when they've lost confidence in any sort of certainty with the administration. So that's something that confuses me at times.
Factory, from construction to legal compliance and everything in between. So is the goal to bring back manufacturing, or is it to get countries to come to the bargaining table and give us more money? Because you can't have both. Second major contradiction, which many have pointed out, these tariffs are not going to be paid by these countries. They are going to be paid by businesses, private entities, attempting to import items from those countries into the US. And as a result, those businesses, because they are money-making ventures, are going to charge us more in order to not cut into their bottom line. And of course, the smaller the business, the greater they'll be hit by these tariffs, because their margins and borrowing ability is much smaller than, say, a Fortune 500 company. So that boutique down the street that sells clothes made in Vietnam, or the corner store that sells imported Chinese food products that you can't find anywhere else, they're not going to turn to American-made goods to supply their inventory. They're going to raise prices to cover the tariffs, and then they're going to go out of business when people don't buy their stuff because it's more affordable at big box stores, or because these tariffs wiped out their retirement savings that they were living off of and they can't afford it anymore. And the third area of faulty logic is the idea that these tariffs are mitigating against currency manipulation and other anti-free trade practices that other countries are committing. Tariffs are the antithesis to free trade. They are regulations put in place to try to control the free market. Increasingly high tariffs are a very strange tactic for a party that has for decades been staunchly free trade. It doesn't make logical sense on so many fronts when these tariffs are analyzed from a typical Republican stance of free trade, laissez-faire economics, and smaller government with fewer regulations. And I think that's why we're seeing pushback even from the right, which we'll get into, but it is worth quickly examining how we got to these tariffs in order to understand them, because they cannot be understood through a traditional Republican lens. They have to be understood through the lens of the people behind the scenes pulling the strings to enact these tariffs, because Trump didn't come up with this by himself. Enter Peter Navarro, the chief architect behind Trump's tariff plan. Here's how the New York
Oh no, not Peter Navarro and his dodgy ass books. Here we go.
Times describes him: a Rasputin-like China hawk who whispers anti-China musings in President Trump's ear. Love any opportunity to bring Rasputin into things, honestly. Navarro holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University, and honestly, I'm starting to believe Harvard will give those out to anyone, because good Lord, this guy is a kook. He's written 13 books and is incredibly pro-tariff, anti-China, and also generally written off by most economists as a fringe theorist at best. It was revealed over 6 years ago, though this information is once again making the media rounds, first published in an article from the Chronicle of Higher Education, that a lot of his most asinine theories are based on the musings of a fictional China expert that Navarro made up and cited to at least a dozen times in his books. That made-up person is named Ron Vera, a name which, in truly Voldemortian fashion, Navarro crafted by taking the letters of his own last name and rearranging them. Navarro, when rearranged, turns into Ron Vera. Again, this man has a PhD from Harvard. They must be giving doctorates out like candy over in Cambridge, Massachusetts. When asked to comment on the revelation, Navarro simply compared himself to Alfred Hitchcock, saying that the Ron Vera character was like a Hitchcockian cameo, and saying it was, quote, refreshing that someone finally figured out his little inside joke. In a text message to the New York Times, he wrote, quote, as Ron Vera might say, lighten up and have fun reading the books, which is actually insane for an academic to say about his academic nonfiction writing. Like, I need a psychologist to go into the White House and figure out just how many of Trump's advisors have personality disorders, because I imagine the number is not zero. I listened to an interview with Peter Navarro recently on the New York Times podcast, The Daily, February 18th, titled A Conversation with the Architect of Trump's New Trade War, and was struck when he said that Trump was once asked about his favorite books about China, and Trump listed Navarro's book, The Coming China Wars, by name. Like Trump knows the name of a book off the top of his head and maybe even read it. Everything I've known about the man is turned up on its head. Turns out, though, probably not. In fact, that recent interview I listened to wasn't the first time Navarro had spun his yarn that Trump had read The Coming China Wars. Back in 2016, in an interview with KPBS San Diego, he told the same story, that in 2011, an LA Times reporter was trying to corner Trump in a gotcha moment, asking him what his favorite books on China are, but Trump showed that reporter when he listed off 15 books by name. But that story's been debunked, and it's unclear whether that interview with Trump ever even happened at all. Despite numerous reputable news sources mentioning it over the last nearly 15 years since it happened, there is no primary source evidence indicating that it actually ever did happen. The interviews that have actual evidence of ever happening, in which Trump is asked about his reading habits, show him either deflect.
Isn't it crazy that the media can just completely make up stories about and make up narratives about certain people to, improve like their messaging and stuff? That's so insane. Someone just made up a story of him just like recalling all these books and stuff. That's crazy.
Deflecting, saying he's too busy to read because he watches TV instead, or saying that his first favorite book is the Bible and his second favorite book is his own book, The Art of the Deal. I guarantee you he's never read either of them. In fact, according to recent reporting by MSNBC, Trump likely only knows Peter Navarro exists because his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was looking for new economic advisors and did a search of books on Amazon and was impressed with the title of Peter Navarro's book, Death by China, and cold called Peter Navarro to see if he would step in as economic advisor. Like, he scrolled through Amazon book recommendations and was like, this guy'll do. As always, it's hard to exactly suss out.
That is just not the way that you pick an economic advisor. That is not how you choose an economic advisor.
The truth when relying on known compulsive liars, but the point is, Peter Navarro comes from dubious origins and espouses made-up Looney Tunes economic theories backed up somehow by a PhD from Harvard, which means you can say pretty much anything and people are like, well, he went to Harvard, mustn't question. And it's one thing when it's a kooky professor publishing unfounded, miscited information in books nobody reads. It's another thing when that man, as the New York Times put it, is a Rasputin-like China hawk who whispers anti-China musings in President Trump's ear. And this Rasputin has even put a rift between Trump and his very favorite special sidekick, Elon Musk, who said the following in a video meeting with Italy's right-leaning League Party.
Europe and the United States should move, ideally, in my view, to a zero tariff situation, effectively creating a free trade zone between Europe.
Well, yes, because if you're a Republican, you're supposed to believe in free trade. So what Elon Musk is saying is literally, because normally when you have a free trade situation, it's now up to each economy to try and provide as much value as possible so they can be the ones exporting more than they import. That's what happens in a free trade system. But I digress.
And North America.
He also took a swipe at Navarro on Twitter, saying a PhD in econ from Harvard is a bad thing, not a good thing. Results in the ego divided by brains is greater than one problem.
Luke is saying, when are we going to connect this back? It's just more to have an understanding of how the tariffs came into place. First, we've already done the connection because in fashion, we know all of this. You can just relate it specifically to manufacturing and the specific regions that are manufactured, that are big manufacturing hubs in fashion. So let's say like Turkey or Vietnam, China, those kind of places. So I think it's very, very important, especially because China is one of the most important places for the fashion industry, not just for manufacturing, but also for customers and consumers, right? So everything about what's going on politically in China directly affects the fashion, like so directly affects the fashion industry. Like it's quite one-to-one.
Problem, meaning your ego becomes bigger than your smarts. And in the greatest evidence yet that Navarro is more of a showman than an economist, he made a sick comeback calling Elon a car salesman who's simply protecting his own interests. Nice. So we have a completely made up, incorrect, error-ridden mathematical formula based on nothing, determining reciprocal tariff rates that aren't even
Also, Kay, you made a good point. The EU has for years been trying to get EVs from anywhere but China. That's great for Tesla, which is very true, because obviously, like a lot of the main EV company in the UK is Tesla, and then we also get EVs from like Germany and Italy and stuff, and that's the thing. So like Trump is acting like all you people are just like China sympathizers and all this sort of stuff. But it's like most countries don't actually, their relations with China is also like fishy, right? The EU doesn't have like fantastic relations with China themselves.
reciprocal, likely orchestrated by a man who cites two made up characters in his books who's whispering in the ear of a megalomaniac authoritarian oligarch who couldn't care less whether any of us lives or dies. It's not quite the same, but Trump literally said he couldn't care less if auto prices increased as a result of these tariffs, and they are almost guaranteed to do so, hurting American manufacturers' bottom lines in the process and likely leading to layoffs and closures. Navarro's stated reasoning for why he is so dead set on tariffs is that he believes it will raise money for the government, which will then lead to lower taxes.
So Nathan is asking, is this good for fashion or a bad one? I think it just depends how you see it. So it's bad. I'll say why it's good and I'll say why it's bad. I'll kind of like give a balanced take on this one. So it's good in the sense that if a lot of these Asian manufacturing hubs are forced into having to pay these insane tariffs, it means that clothing becomes more expensive in general. And if clothing becomes more expensive, people that are buying these clothes, one, they're going to buy less clothing, which will lead to less overconsumption, and overconsumption will slow down, definitely. Also, it will kind of kill a lot of fast fashion because a lot of people, considering that everything will be expensive, won't be willing to pay loads of money on something that's going to disintegrate in a few wears. The reason why people are okay with buying Shein and Temu now is because they're like, okay, I know I'm only going to wear this dress once, but at least it only costs $4. So it's fine. I can like get rid of it. But even people that don't care about the environment or don't care about overconsumption will be forced into caring about it when your cheap dress now costs $75. So now you can't just think of it like, I'm only going to wear this once and throw it away, because that becomes significantly more expensive. It also means that a lot of companies will really struggle financially. It will lead to a lot of fashion companies folding. So that's definitely like a negative thing. It will mean that the cost for a lot of companies won't be able to stomach it. And if they have to put that cost onto consumers, the cost will be so high that consumers won't buy, leading these companies to folding. It's only really the big conglomerates that can afford, on the drop of a bucket, to be like, okay, let's move our manufacturing to regions that aren't tariffed as high in the US. So let's move it to, Turkey and other sort of regions like that. They are the only ones that have the infrastructure to do those kind of things. And even they won't really move stuff that quickly because it takes so long to move this sort of stuff. And then also they don't know if they need to, because Trump is all over the place with his policies. So even they have to wait. But in the meantime, they're bleeding money. A lot of them are bleeding money. So it's good and bad, depending on how you see it. It's definitely bad for businesses, though. I think this will lead to a lot of fashion businesses suffering and a lot of factories suffering, a lot of manufacturers suffering. So across the board, in that sense, it's bad. But in terms of like consumers and overconsumption and sustainability, I think it could be potentially a good thing for sure. Let me see what you guys are saying in the chat also. So why don't you fight against them? Why does the EU just lie down and take it? Like, is it just the way the EU is? The EU is not lying down and taking it. They were planning retaliatory tariffs, but they paused it because Trump obviously had a 90-day pause period. Also, they did actually put tariffs in place initially, which is why you had people like Harley Davidson fans complaining like, oh my God, my Harley Davidsons are going to be more expensive, because they are targeting the automotive industry in the US. So they're not just taking it. The EU definitely is not just taking it. That's not what's happening. No government is just taking it. I am deeply appreciating you bringing us together to learn and anchoring it in fashion. I'm going to finish watching this live before my closing shift tonight. Good luck with your shift, Jay. Good luck with your shift. Good luck with your shift. I think infinite growth is definitely a bad thing. However, I just don't think it's possible. So I think the markets normally take care of themselves. So I've always complained about conglomerates having this idea that we're going to grow into the ether and we're never going to stop growing, which literally doesn't make sense, because mathematically you get to a point where every single customer on the planet, every single person on the planet is now one of your consumers, and then you actually physically cannot grow more than that. So there's always a cap on how much a company can grow. But a lot of these fashion conglomerates, their business model is based on the fact that they can continue growing, which doesn't actually make any sense. So no, I don't think infinite growth is a good thing, but I just think that the markets will always take care of themselves eventually. They always will. All this tariff woke nonsense on my Japanese proxy shit's gonna be more expensive. That's hilarious. That's so funny. But I'll show you guys actually what I was talking about in terms of the tariffs that the EU put on the automotive industry, just so that you guys are aware that the EU doesn't just take this sitting back. I think maybe in the US or maybe other places, it isn't covered in the media how a lot of the different countries are retaliating. But obviously, I live in a European country, so our news literally focuses on like the EU specifically and the UK and stuff. So yeah. So here we go. So here's an example, for example, via the Wall Street Journal. So Harley Davidson has said its products are afflicted by unfair trade policies. And if the European Union implements a 50% retaliatory tariff on its motorcycles in April, prices could reach astounding heights in the company's second largest market by sales. So the company's Road Glide model, which starts at 28K in the US, is already around 77K in Denmark, with the included 25% value added tax and a 150% luxury tax, and that could soar to 124K with the proposed EU tariff. The company is calling for its foreign rivals to face reciprocal duties when they export bikes to the US. Competitor brands should not be allowed to take advantage of low-cost manufacturing and preferential import duty when accessing the US market, Root said. So, like I said, there are many markets that are affected directly by the EU retaliating. Also, you need to take into account that all of these things are not in a vacuum. And I have to drive this point home, right? Just because if Trump's plans work, there is a net positive. There are so many industries that will suffer. And if you work in any of those specific industries, you will lose your jobs, you will have no job, the industries will tank. A lot of those industries will cease to exist, maybe, if it's really, really that bad in terms of their ability to trade and, you know, have raw materials to even make those goods in the first place. So it's not, this thing is not perfectly balanced the way that some people think it's going to be. That's not really how these things work, to be honest. Let me see what you guys are saying in the chat. Come on, guys, like the page. 75 likes and 150 listeners. Yes, please, guys. Please do give me a like. Please do give me a like. Literally, my biggest concern at the moment is if my buyer orders are going to get taxed now. I mean, they definitely will. So while there's a 90-day period, buy everything you need to buy, because once the tariffs come back into effect, good luck. Everything's going to be so expensive. So expensive. So the Bentley you guys produce and what else? So we actually produce a lot. So not only do we produce, of course, like Land Rovers and Bentleys and blah, 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 blah. We produce, and that's just in the UK. The EU produces a lot of the like German cars. They produce the raw materials for a lot of the German cars. So we're talking Audi, Mercedes, that sort of stuff. A lot of the motorcycles are definitely produced there. And also a lot of the motorcycling market is Asian based. So you look at, or just automotive industry, you look at the likes of Toyota, you look at the likes of Suzuki, Kawasaki, like all these companies, right? These are all some of the biggest manufacturers of automotives across the world. So the automotive industry specifically, which is why I focus on that industry, because that is what the EU is focusing on, they can really hurt the US automotive industry by imposing crazy tariffs. Like they can severely damage the automotive industry. Like the automotive industry in the US will really, really suffer. So the EU is not capping. They're not capping at all. They produce a lot of automotives. And it's not just that they produce the cars or the motorcycles, it's that they produce the raw materials that are used to make these. Also, you need to remember, apart from that, when you think of defense, a lot of the, like, let's say, military vehicles, military weapons, military planes are also produced in European countries. So that's also another thing where they can hurt the US economy. So going back to it once again, all the other countries are not just lying down and taking it at all. That's not what is happening. It's not what's happening at all. But anyway, let's go back to the video, guys. Let's go back to the video.
The government will levy higher tariffs. Businesses will pay them to import their goods. The government will have more money, so they'll need to tax the people less. The problem that most economists who actually have a toe in reality point out is that increased tariffs have consequences, like retaliatory tariffs from other countries, like increased prices on everyday goods, like hurting American businesses. And those consequences will slow the economy down. And they will be felt the most by middle and lower income Americans, because a billionaire doesn't know what an egg costs, let alone notice when egg prices change. A billionaire can buy whatever car they want without noticing the price.
Also, VJ is saying that the EU makes airplane engines. Exactly. Like even like Bentley, for example, makes a lot of engines for planes, but there are other companies that are specifically focused on like the military plane engines and consumer plane engines too. So all of that is all produced across the EU and regions in Asia. So yeah, they're not, it's a misconception that they're sitting down and taking it. Maybe the media portrays it that way because they're trying to push, I guess, an agenda that they're just trying to make the tariffs seem overly positive in the US and not really talking about any of the drawbacks or giving any sort of balanced take on the whole thing, but that's not reality.
Multimillionaires will still buy their Switch 2 and their new car and their imported washing machines and their shoes made in Italy and their organic produce from Mexico, and they won't notice a thing. Meanwhile, lower income Americans will not only feel the squeeze at the grocery store and anytime they need a new pair of shoes, they'll also have a harder time even finding those things to begin with because there will be less of them in the market due to the slowing economy. And those that do exist will have higher prices. And then on that magical fairy tale day that Navarro promises when the tax cuts magically rain down upon us, they will mostly benefit the richest Americans who already don't pay their fair share. And the rest of us, if there ever even is a tax cut, which is definitely not a given outcome of increased tariffs, might see a modest drop in the taxes we pay. But that would be after literal years of being pummeled with supply chain issues and overpriced goods due to tariffs. The only people who benefit from this no pain, no gain approach that Trump is advocating for are the rich, who feel the pricing.
Yep, it's so important to mention that because it's so important to mention this because something that Trump has said in one of his recent statements, he said, he was like, oh, no pain, no gain. It's going to be a lot of pain now for a lot of prosperity later. But who can afford in the meantime to just suffer because, well, it's going to be better soon? In the meantime, people are going to be bleeding. They're going to be going into credit card debt. The debt isn't just going to go away when prosperity comes. Like, it only favors ultra rich people that can afford to be in a state where the economy is messed up, prices of goods are really high. Who the hell can afford that apart from someone who's really, really rich? That's another thing that I find weird because it's like, who can survive in those conditions in the meantime?
Increases less and who get the most out of tax cuts. And even they are feeling the squeeze right now. Last week, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by over 1,500 points 2 days in a row. That's the first time that has ever happened. The market overall has seen the greatest dip it's seen since March 2020 when the pandemic hit. The S&P 500 is nearing bear market territory, meaning it's lost almost 20% since its peak. Last week alone, the S&P 500 fell by nearly 6% in one day. 6% is when the circuit breaker kicks in and pauses all trading for 15 minutes to protect against a complete market free fall. Earlier today, amid unsubstantiated rumors that Trump was going to pause the tariffs on Wednesday, the markets jumped back up, only to crash back down when the administration said on Twitter that it was all fake news. The extreme volatility is sending investors into an even greater tailspin, sowing doubt in the stability and strength of this economy. Worldwide, markets everywhere have been in free fall, from Europe to Japan. Germany's index fell into near bear market territory. Hong Kong's fell more than 13%. Shanghai's by over 8%. Japan's by nearly 8%. The volatility index, which measures market volatility, so higher is worse, is the highest it's been since the pandemic. One analyst described it to the BBC as a bloodbath. Goldman Sachs raised its forecast from 35% to a 45% chance the US will fall into a recession in the next 12 months. JP Morgan estimates a 60% chance of a US and global recession. The world's richest billionaires lost $200 billion in a single day last week.
Of course, since a lot of them have gained the money back, obviously, since Trump paused it. So obviously that update needs to be mentioned. But once again, with how many people are saying that there's potential to have a recession, who the hell can afford a recession if you're not rich? Like, can someone answer that question? So all the people that are supporting this, do you have the money to survive a recession? Do you, watching this, have the money to survive through a global recession? Do you guys have the savings for that? Because a lot of people are supporting this, like, yeah, we're going to have prosperity. I would love to see if these same people can afford to live during a recession. That's what I want to see.
Mark Zuckerberg alone lost $18 billion in one day. This has led to rare backlash by billionaires aimed at the Trump administration. Billionaire investor Bill Ackman took to Twitter to lambast the president, saying, quote, "The president is losing the confidence of business leaders around the globe," and adding, quote, "We are heading for a self-induced economic nuclear winter, and we should start hunkering down," which says a lot because billionaires literally have bunkers in which to hunker. Ackman added in his post, quote, "This is not what we voted for." And this echoes the overarching Republican response to these tariffs as well, from rank and file voters to members of Congress. One user on conservative subreddit named Harry Eyeballs put it well when he said, quote, "I get the sense I'm not being told the truth." Or user Comprehensive Town 919 on Republican subreddit saying, "I need someone to help me understand what exactly these tariffs are going to help us on, because right now, all I'm seeing is the prices for simple everyday living items continuing to go up. This is not what I voted for, and I want to know why this is happening." With user Quality responding, "This was Trump's main economic policy proposal during the 2024 election campaign." And another user responding, "This is what you voted for." And this is the Republican subreddit. Its profile picture is literally of Donald Trump's face. TikTok user MostFace2, who's not conservative but has been apparently following conservative subreddit since 2014, noted this is a huge shift in rhetoric on this subreddit.
Lately, the comments on there are nothing like I have ever seen. I've never seen it be this consistently anti-Trump with flared users, legit representatives of that community. This bubble that has been ironclad for a long time, for like a decade, is starting to pop. It's a change I have not seen in over 10 years.
Even Republicans in Congress are showing rifts in their typically lockstep support of Trump's agenda. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky told reporters, quote, "When President William McKinley most famously put tariffs on in 1890, they lost 50%.
Guys, I'm wearing a ripped cap. It's a recession indicator. Get to know, get to know. Get your indie sleaze recession indicator clothes ready, guys. It's coming.
To their seats in the next election. When Smoot and Hawley put on their tariff in the early 1930s, we lost the House and the Senate for 60 years. So they're not only bad economically, they're bad politically. Perhaps most notably, a new bill is gaining rare bipartisan support from the likes of Mitch McConnell and Amy Klobuchar. The bill would limit the president's power to impose new tariffs, and instead the president would have to obtain congressional approval. Congress would also retain the power to end any tariff at any time. And this isn't a revolutionary idea. The Constitution literally gives the power to tax and tariff to the Congress. But over the centuries, Congress has slowly...
Yeah, William Clark, you're right. I think a lot of people don't actually know what they're voting for. So many people just vote based on some tiny emotional thing rather than actually reading and looking at all the policies that the person that they are voting for is, advocating for. It's quite sad how many people don't, look deeply into the policy, where people who consider themselves Republicans are like, this is not what I voted for. But that's what you voted for. Trump literally talks about this all the time. Like, what? Did these people not read any of the policies that the presidents are actually trying to advocate for? It's crazy.
Passed laws offloading that duty onto the president. However, many Republicans are not jumping on board with the new bill, instead deciding to tentatively support Trump, with Senate Majority Leader John Thune saying he's giving Trump the benefit of the doubt. As Democratic Senator Brian Schatz put it, mostly everyone hates this. They are just too afraid of the Mad King at the moment. And that about sums it up. And while we can look at reactions on the right and left, the volatility of the market and economic forecasts to try to see what's going to happen, the reality is that nobody really knows. No one's done something like this before, not to this extent, with this little support, with this little backing in reality or how economics works, with this little care for the consequences or the fallout. Europe is talking about enacting more retaliatory tariffs. China
also, in a recession, by the way, for people that don't know, it is a wealth distribution. I hope you know that, because one thing I will say about recessions, from what I've seen, this happened during COVID as well, is rich people own the companies that provide necessities, and everyone has to buy necessities, even when you have no money. So even if you are poor, to survive, you need to eat. In winter, to survive, you need heating. You need these things. Who are the people that provide electricity, gas, food? Who owns Walmart? Who owns the grocery stores that we see? So people who don't have a lot of money in a recession will have to go into any sort of credit to buy these necessities. And that money is going into the pockets of the people that provide these necessities, which are rich people. So all that a recession is going to do is just widen the class divide and the class gap between the middle class, the working class, and then obviously the rich people in society, right? Which is why I find it weird that most people advocate for stuff like this, because most people voted for Trump. That's why he won. So it's confusing, because it's like most people gain to lose from it.
China already has. Rumors that the tariffs will be postponed on Wednesday have already come and gone and will probably come again. He may pause them on Wednesday. He's done it before. The result, whether the tariffs stick or not, is increased global economic uncertainty in the face of all of this volatility. The result is further alienating countries that were once our allies, relationships that will take decades to fix, long after Trump is gloriously cold and dead in the ground. Our 401ks have already lost value and will likely lose some more, though it's unclear how long that will last. Is it a shorter blip, like the market response to the pandemic in 2020, or is it a protracted recession, the globalization bubble bursting, something closer to 2008, which some people are still recovering from? Yeah, still. There are genuine, real consequences happening right now, and there are disparate and sometimes unforeseeable consequences that will come, likely for all of us, in different ways. Time will tell how deep this downturn goes, but it is true that all of us, regardless of political ideology, are going to be uncomfortable, either from literal economic squeeze or just general economic uncertainty for a while. Okay, here's the part of the episode where I usually tell you what to do about it. And I'm not an economic advisor, but I do have a type A sister who taught me about personal finance from a young age. And I've also been doing a lot of thinking for the last week because I took it off and it was not restful. I was just spiraling. So happy to be back. Here's what I'm doing and thinking about. Recessions have happened. World wars have happened. Pandemics have happened multiple times. Through it all, despite incredible volatility and economic hardship, which
Nathan, I don't think you were here earlier. I'm not sure if you were here earlier, but I talked about this already. That the way that the US deems other countries charging tax on them, it doesn't work that way. That's not how trade deficits work. Like, that's not how it works. Normally, so I'll put it this way. The reason why a country can get away with putting tariffs on the US, that the US didn't put tariffs back on it, yet the US is still importing more from that country with higher tariffs than the US sends to them, can only happen because the US has something to gain from it. And you can see that across so many businesses, whether that's, companies taking advantage of the low labor cost in regions in Asia, or the manufacturing expertise in China and stuff like that. So that's why they can get away with it. It's this simplistic view of they tax us, so we tax them the thing back, without taking into account what the industries need, where these things are produced, who has the expertise to produce these things, why companies go to these countries instead of producing the infrastructure themselves in their own home countries. It removes any of that nuance. So it's too simplistic to be like, they charge us more in tariffs than we charge them, let's balance it. That's not how these things work. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind-the-scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.